Thanks, everyone. We're recording today on September 12th, starting with Iamblichus the Mysterious, and we have Farjana and Optio currently with us. We did begin to discuss, before recording, we were discussing some of the reasons, we're here to discuss Iamblichus. I myself have been a practitioner, I believe, of theurgy for the last year and a half, and I did read Iamblichus about the same time that I really began to get into practicing theurgy, and I found that there were a lot of really cool things that he said, but there were a lot of things that I didn't necessarily understand. But what I did understand really excited my interest, and in a lot of ways deepened my spiritual self-awareness. And I think I've had that with all of the readings that I've had since I have gotten back into the occult, which I was discussing the last time we met with Ryan. I kind of been in and out of the occult for a while throughout my life, when I was a teenager, of course. And then, I went into more traditional religion. And then I've been part of more traditional religion in and out of that for the last 30 years or so. And then just recently I began reading some things by the Neoplatonists. And this was all spurred by a reading that I had of Gershom Scholem. You may know him as the major scholar, if you will, of the Kabbalah. And I was reading his book on the Godhead, and he had a snippet in there from a rabbi describing a visitation that this rabbi had of this luminous being that appeared to him. And I was going, and that jogged a memory of mine, which has always stuck with me, but I didn't necessarily recall, throughout all of the things that I have been doing for a while. But that jogged a memory that when I was in college, the first time, I went to college twice, but the first time I was in college, I had this overwhelming experience of this being of light that was standing in front of me, and it was an amazing, overpowering experience, which I was then, unfortunately, at that time, not able to appreciate because I was doing all kinds of illicit drugs and and drinking mostly. So that really helped me to start this new journey that I've been on for the last 2 years or so, where I've tracked down this notion of, I've been trying to track down this notion of a luminous body, or a some type of apparition, or whatever it is that appeared to me. So I've been tracking it through the different resources that I could find about it, and I eventually ended up with in Neoplatonism with Proclus's discussion of it in on the elements of theology, where he talks about it in really highly philosophical terms. But there's a great essay at the end of the book which describes what they call the spiritual body, or this the vehicle of the soul, which carries the soul from the other realms into this realm, and then back again. And what happens is, as it comes from the higher realm into this realm, it becomes impure, and what you have to do is purify this spiritual vehicle of all impurities and material attachments, etc., so that it can then rise and become aware of and be receptive to the radiations, as they call them, from, or the energies from these higher realms. So basically, the God. You know, if we start looking at as we start looking at Iamblichus, he's talking about the gods and how they actually communicate with us and communicate with our souls, but also with, you know, being able to somehow get our spiritual vehicle purified, and that's where we will begin. Are there any questions? Anyone want to go into any of their reasons for attending the session?
I'll just say hello to anyone that's new, and sorry I'm late.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for coming, and thanks for letting me know that you might be a little bit late.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought we would move it up because, you know, Farjana, of course, and Optio as well, I think. They're looking very late hours, though.
No, of course. All good.
Get it as early as possible. Ryan, was in the last session, we had a very wide, far-ranging discussion about many of the contextual elements of Iamblichus. And I didn't want to go so much into that now. I think those can come out as we begin discussing the actual text. And for those who haven't seen maybe the outlines of what we're looking at, it would be, we're hoping to, or I'm hoping to be able to do like a really close reading of things within Iamblichus's text. So today we'd be looking at books 1 through 3, and kind of look at, if you have hopefully you have the reading in front of you. If you look, we can kind of call out passages that are interesting to us, to us, and then discuss those. But so this would be, it wouldn't necessarily be a line by line discussion, but word for word. But we can take paragraphs at a time. But I wanted to start out with book 1, chapter 1, which we talked about earlier, about the structure of the De Mysteriis. It's broken out into books and then so-called chapters. And of course, this is something that was not in the way that Iamblichus actually organized it and wrote it. This is something that occurred once the text was recovered during the Renaissance, and then began to be studied during the Renaissance. That was one of the great achievements of the Renaissance, was to take these old texts and to begin to organize them so that they could be more accessible to readers. The first one, what pops out in it immediately when you begin book 1, chapter 1, is the mention of Hermes, and at the same time we have a discussion of of the writer here, who calls himself an Egyptian priest or prophet. And what's striking about this is that obviously Iamblichus is a Greek. He's a Greek philosopher. He's one of the main students of Porphyry, whose letter we've read as a background to this. He's basically set up to be the follow-on leader of the Platonic Academy in Athens after Porphyry. Once Porphyry dies, Iamblichus would be the one who would take over the main administrative activities and teaching teaching activities within the Platonic Academy. But he, kind of jump ahead. He does not do that. He ends up setting up his own academy. But one of the reasons, perhaps, is that he's begun to find out for himself, this is the Iamblichus, that the way the Platonic Academy has gone so far is not either in the spirit of Plato or somehow has lost its way in purely philosophical, what he would call philosophical and even philosophically skeptical types of argumentation for argumentation's sake. And he's talking about, well, okay, we need to begin to look at making philosophy, if we're going to really follow Plato, we need to make this a life rather than just a way of talking or arguing about specific topics. And that's where he begins to take up, in the guise of an Egyptian priest, what the Egyptian priests can contribute to our understanding of the higher realms. What from the Egyptians can we carry over into a discipline and a way of life that would enrich our understanding of ourselves, but also our understanding of the higher realm, which is would be one of the goals of a Platonic philosopher, following, in the footsteps of Plotinus, which is to become one with the higher self and to find one's soul in a region above and beyond the purely material.
I think that, also, hello everybody. Thank you for holding this group. I think that tension between the sort of just the intellectual life of arguing and putting forth sort of premises and asking questions versus something that's more embodied and lived is also something that comes out pretty directly in chapter 1, because most of it is him like scolding Porphyry basically for asking bad questions or asking the questions incorrectly in a way that essentially implies you don't really know what you're talking about because you've never done theurgy, and I am a theurgist and I will tell you how it actually is, and I'll correct your questions so that they're asked correctly. Like, that's even before they can get into the substance of the questions. He has to sort of like explain how he's going to answer them, because from a position of lived experience with these practices.
Right.
To jump in there, I've got a question for all you guys with regards to this. And I think that it's largely based in like my own experiences with this stuff. Do you guys sense, like, one of my sort of like through lines that I've noticed as I've been reading through this text these past few weeks is like some fairly clear analogs to how I talk about my spiritual life in the modern context. I know, like, last week and the week before, we talked about sort of like Porphyry has this role of the skeptic, right? And obviously that's a fairly important, like, that sort of materialistic worldview is, and I maybe materialistic isn't the word to use when describing Porphyry, but that skeptical worldview is certainly very relevant in our day-to-day. So just wondering, did anyone else sense a degree of like defensiveness in the first few chapters in Iamblichus? Because I certainly did, especially given the idea that, this is largely a defense of traditional, or like at least what is perceived to be traditional religious practice. And I found that very interesting. Last week, Chez and I discussed whether or not Iamblichus or Porphyry was taking the reactionary position. And I was wondering if you guys wanted to speak to that. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I don't know if I would say defensiveness. I guess you could call it that. I see actually analogs to how a lot of sorry, let me try and explain this in a way that makes sense. I think that Iamblichus's seeming defensiveness, it seems like it's coming from a position not of like personal offense, like I personally am offended and I need to set the record straight. He like jumps in as the sort of leader of this school, and he seems to be defending what he sees as the position of the school that he's representing, or the tradition that he's representing. I guess to me that feels different than a sort of personal defensiveness coming from an individual who feels offended about something. And the reason that I feel like this is a distinction worth making is because I see analogs today in sort of spiritual groups or groups that pride themselves on having a tradition, that they want to represent that in the best light possible. So I see what you're saying, and I think it definitely comes from this sense of pride in like coming from a representing a tradition.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's even like makes a lot of sense as to why he would take, or why he would be playing the role of the Egyptian, right? Mm-hmm. Like the Egyptian framework had so much legitimacy and respect, from what I understand about the time, you know? So it makes sense that would be the framework he operated under. I mean, it's not really that. It's more of just an observation than anything else that I found interesting. But yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to jump in just for a second. That's interesting. You bring up why he takes the role of the Egyptian and why it is Egyptian religion that he's somehow thinking is key and important for his presentation. There are traditions that go back to Pythagoras and they go back to Plato that they did in fact learn everything or a lot of what they knew from the Egyptians. So it could be that, you know, literally Iamblichus is saying, okay, well, we're at a dead end here with this type of philosophy and way of life that you're representing, Porphyry, which is really weird because Porphyry and Plotinus had actually started up a wholly new way of looking at Platonism, right? But he's saying, okay, well, we even need to go farther than you. And in order to do that, we need to go back to sources. We need to go back to the sources that our father Plato, our father Pythagoras, where they got their inspiration, where they got their knowledge from. So I just wanted to put that in there and see how that, if that fits.
I think that, yeah, I don't know. I think that hits the nail on the head, because I think that it's something that kept happening over and over again throughout history, that we don't even need to look as far back as Iamblichus to see this kind of Egyptian drag. If we look at more modern examples of people who are basically trying to do theurgy, like if I'm thinking of in the 19th century, there were all of these occult groups that popped up, like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and all this stuff. They called themselves Hermetic. They explicitly referenced the Egyptians. They did like fake Egyptian ceremonies, or I suppose I shouldn't say fake, that sounds too derogatory, but they did Egyptian-inspired modern ceremonies, and they were essentially doing the same move rhetorically that we're talking about here, which is to try and find the society with the most cachet for being spiritually advanced that they could, and then trying to take that on and learn from that in a new context, and like speak from that position as someone who's part of this tradition. And it seems like Iamblichus probably has had much more of a legitimate claim to that than a bunch of British aristocrats in the 1800s did. But I think that we can still contextualize and understand this move because people have kept doing it pretty much straight up into the modern day.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that. Like, I mean, I run in some of these like circles online, and I would say that has that's full steam ahead on that in a lot of sort of like contexts of ritual magic. So yeah.
I have to
So
agree.
go ahead, Farzana.
I do agree with that. Like, there's been so much.
Sorry, Farzana.
I can't really hear you.
Maybe. Can you hear me?
Whoops.
Are you far away from your microphone?
Because I'm
You can
on.
hear me.
Oh,
Oh, there you are.
can you hear me now?
It's
Yes.
better.
Is that okay now? Or?
It's better, yes.
I can hear myself echo. I think it's.
Oh, there we
because
go. No, that's
a lot
great.
better there.
Okay, we can
Is
hear
that
fine.
okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, no, sorry. I was just going to say that I do agree, because I've seen the same thing, that throughout history it's been repeated, and it seems like they're derivative of, you know, the main one, and this idea of all these different sects and all these different divisions have kind of come from there. That's why I've always been interested in going to those people of knowledge that got it straight from the source. Because if it's just regurgitated from one book to the other and it's passed down with no experiential knowledge, then it's going to get diluted. And I think that's one of the reasons why Iamblichus did really kind of back up what he said, because he knew from his own personal experience and he knew it to be true. That's kind of what I think.
Yeah.
So,
As far as the experience, and I, that goes to me to perhaps a question that I have asked. I mean, when I first read this, it's like I'm thinking, okay, Iamblichus is kind of faking it. He's kind of faking being an Egyptian in order to get across a philosophical point. But and I think that was true. That may have been actually a carryover of some of the translations, because some of the translations, like going back to the Thomas Taylor translations, etc., kind of give you the notion, hey, this is a guy who's dressing up as an Egyptian, trying to get across a new message, perhaps, which he thinks is new, but it's really not Egyptian. It's really just him kind of putting a costume on Platonism. But that's not true. He is living it, and he did live it, and it's possible, quite possible, that he did understand and did study what we now know as Hermetism, which is from the Corpus Hermeticum.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of biases that basically did make people sort of predisposed to think that first thing, to think that it's just sort of Egyptian drag. And I used that phrase before, kind of jokingly, but I think a lot of people really take that very hard line stance. But I also wonder how much we have to assume that he's lying. Like, in order to uphold that hypothesis, we have to assume he's lying a little bit, because he says over and over again, for example, like in chapter 2, which I have it on page 11 of the version of the translation that I have. I tried to look up the translation that you mentioned, and I found a version online which was like facing pages, one page in English and one in Greek. I don't speak Greek, but it's nice. But in my version, it's on page 11, and he says some of these, meaning some of these questions, such as require experience of actions, meaning in the footnote it says ritual actions, theurgy. Some of these questions, such as require experience of ritual actions for their accurate understanding, it will not be possible to deal with adequately by words alone. This is basically him showing his hand and saying, I know these things because I do them. And I think that if we want to continue with the kind of stodgy idea that he's definitely faking it, we have to assume that when he says these things, he's just lying. And that seems like a strong claim to me.
almost like, why would he be doing this? I mean, I guess he could just be like a 4th century grifter, but like, what would be the point of this exercise if he wasn't? That's the thing that I keep coming back to. You know?
That's hilarious. The Alex Jones of the Hellenistic world.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking like one of these like crypto grifters, like, but no, like I just don't see it as like a particularly reasonable claim to a work like this. But I mean, again, that's neither here nor there. That's just based on like my own feeling, really. But I do think. Sorry,
go ahead.
Well, I think you could go. I mean, you know, you don't need to go necessarily as far as like he's trying to pull a real fast one on us. I mean, we certainly do have, let's say, in books of fiction, they take on a character because they want to get across a message. And there's nothing deceitful about the fact that they're putting on a character, put on the message, because the message can be very powerful. I mean, even if I could see myself, in fact, this is pretty much how I first came at it. I could see myself believing that, hey, yeah, he's acting like an Egyptian, and then I get to his message. Oh, well, that's a really powerful message, even if he's not a real Egyptian, and if he doesn't even know anything about Egyptian Hermetism. That's still a very powerful thing that I could understand and somehow adjust to my own reality, of understanding these spiritual things that are happening to me. Now, obviously he's not giving us any steps or anything, but you see what I mean, though. But I mean, I think we could do it that way if we had to, but I think it also adds a dimension to know that he indeed knew something about Egyptian Hermetism. And it's that kind of thing that I think fascinates me, is that he's not just making this up from Platonism, but there is a real tradition which he has access to, which he's bringing to light and discussing. I don't know why that's fascinating to me, to think that here we have and maybe it's just this longing that I have for old things that are somehow authentic because they're old. I don't know if it's that, or if it's something that here's this living tradition which is somehow being uncovered after these thousands of years. When Thomas Taylor translated it, he didn't have all the archaeology. He didn't have all of the, he didn't have the Nag Hammadi text, etc., to supplement how he understands what Iamblichus is saying. So here we have and yet, even though he didn't have that, there was something very powerful for him, which came across. But now that we have all of this further information, I guess it's just confirmation that this is something very real. It's not just people, putting stuff together and maybe that's what you mean by it could have been just a kind of some game that he was trying to play and pull over on it.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that like when you look at the start of chapter 3, I think it kind of like reconciles a lot of those questions. Because while he is placing himself in the role of like the perennialist Egyptian, which had like existed in, Greek esoteric thought, from what I understand, since the time of Plato, he then goes on to talk about this like innate knowledge of the gods, this fact that like it is within us, we are pushing towards it through these actions, and I think that the fact that he does frame it as innate, he frames it as coming from within us, makes me really feel that like the Egyptian stuff is a paint job, like and I think probably recognizes that. It is a way of, again, legitimizing his claims, but like I really think that the core of the argument is that this stuff is within us. That's my reading of chapter 3 anyways.
Yeah, I think that paragraph of chapter 3 is probably the most interesting part of the first 3 chapters altogether. That one paragraph where he talks about that innateness of our knowledge of the gods, because he's making a really mystical argument that almost sounds like it could be pulled out of, like Indian non-dualist religions and things. It's like very kind of transcendent, not transcendent, I don't really know what to call it, just mystical, very non-dualist, but presenting it as if it's a philosophical argument. And but I don't think that that's necessarily evidence that, I don't see why that would lead to it not being somehow authentically connected to Egypt, because if we are taking the idea that things like the Corpus Hermeticum are representing something that legitimately has its heritage in Egyptian religion, well, those texts talk about this kind of thing too. They talk about how the human soul, I mean, that's probably why the Platonists were learning about it, because they had a similar idea of the descent of the soul in some ways, that the soul started as part of sort of this divine wholeness, and it descends into the material world and takes on different qualities. And so you still have this seed of divinity inside of you, and that's how you can come to know the divine, even though you're already incarnated in a human body. And so I don't see why that would make it not Egyptian, because it seems like we could accept that there's this kind of mystical thing, that this sort of perennial mystical thing, but maybe that mystical perennial thing was also in an Egyptian context already.
It was Egyptian too, right? Yeah. Oh, I'd love to know how much, like, and again, I'm no like historian of religion or anything like that, but from what I understand about like the Corpus Hermeticum as it exists today, we've got like the Tobias stuff and then Nag Hammadi, which I mean obviously suggests that these things were fairly widely read within, at least the Eastern Empire at this time. But I like, and again, there isn't an answer to this that anyone can come up with unless we invent a time machine. But like, I would love to know how much of that is in the zeitgeist of religious practice. Because like, also, I think it's important to remember that like Christianization is becoming a very important element as well in the Roman world at this time. And I think that it doesn't necessarily, I guess, surprise me that there's these developments happening in a traditional religious pagan framework, like however you want to define that exactly, when there is this new thing that is, gaining a lot of traction in the world. I see this probably as a lot of response to that as well. And I think that again would enhance the it'd be another reason why the perennialist Egyptian tradition would be important to Iamblichus, because it's like, we are competing against a 250-year-old, 300-year-old cult out of, Judaism with the perennialist tradition, the Greco-Egyptian tradition. I think that would have a lot of sway, especially in like elite Roman circles. So, yeah.
Well, let me go back to the history just a little bit. If Christian Bull's right, he's one. If you have a chance, read his work on Hermetism. The Christians were using the Corpus Hermeticum almost immediately as soon as they began to become prevalent in Egypt, and then also it became very widely known. They became very widely known to like Saint Augustine and the Christians. In fact, they wrote works against the Corpus Hermeticum and those ideas. And you can see where they talk about it and say, well, they actually argue against them, and they're setting up all kinds of texts against them, so that. But they're also stealing from the Corpus Hermeticum, which is really interesting. And I know, Farjana, you want to speak, but let me just finish this. So that's where the Nag Hammadi come in and are very interesting. It's believed, and the evidence seems to point to the fact that these texts, which don't just include Hermetica, but also, of course, include all of the so-called Gnostic writings. This was being collected by Christian monks who wanted to experience the same types of paranormal experiences that the Egyptian priests were experiencing. And we know what the Egyptian priests were experiencing because we have them in the Corpus, the Hermeticum from Nag Hammadi. But we also have them once you begin to see the Corpus Hermeticum in their proper perspective, you can see where they are describing rituals to attain these otherworldly experiences and ultimately oneness with the Godhead, or the Aeneid as they talk about it. Sorry, President, I think I cut you off.
No, that's fine. No, I was just going to go off what I think, was it Ryan? I'm not sure if you said it about the divinity within us. And what kind of interests me and kind of grabbed my attention was the divinity within us. It's almost as if that has to be nurtured, and it has to be grown, and it has to be developed. And if it's done in one of these ways, and I think that there are some ways that facilitate it more than other ways. I think that's where all of these different practices came from. And I think that if that's not done, then other things have a chance to take over. This idea of evil, or this idea of greed, or whatever else can get in the way. So it would be very interesting as we continue to see what he says in terms of the facilitation of this divinity within us, and how we can develop that, and how we can have those experiences. And that's what's really intriguing to me, because I think that if we're not actively engaged in wanting to do that, or striving to do that, is where the idea of being lost and going astray comes from. But innately, we all know. There's a knowing. What keeps bringing us back to this? Because we innately know. We just have a knowing. Where does that come from? So that was a really interesting point. Just wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting too, because that's also, I mean, as he talks about that in the rest of chapter 3 here. And
yeah.
I mean, he doesn't get into any of the techniques or anything, but he starts to give hints. He starts to give little hints.
Yeah. So that's like, okay, where is the juice now? Come on, I need to know a little bit more. I mean, wasn't alchemy kind of a derivative of Hermeticism? I'm pretty sure it came from there. Like,
yeah, a lot of alchemists, they were using Hermetic ideas.
Where they would do their rituals and and their path, and that's where the idea of the Philosopher's Stone came from, and it was their practice or their way that did it. But if it worked for them, how what is it that they did? Like, how?
Yeah, I bet we're going to get some details later on in the book, but I think in this beginning we even get some beginnings though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we see that it's a higher knowledge than reason, as he talks about here. It's higher than knowledge and or reason, right? Judgment and choice is superior there's an innate knowledge, but that knowledge is something beyond judgment and choice, reasoning and proof.
Yes.
How do we get to the point where we're beyond? You know, what would it even mean to get beyond what I take as my everyday thought process?
Yeah, I mean, an idea that what I've come to see or learn is that it's internally acquired. So knowledge can be externally received, externally acquired, but also internally received. And I guess that's where the idea of insight comes from. It kind of comes from inside of us. Like, it's not externally acquired.
Yeah.
But then both of them together, when we're studying externally and then we're receiving internally, is where we get the whole. And that I think that's what it means. Internal spiritual insight.
Yeah, I like Iamblichus' little summary here, which is at the very end of chapter 3. He basically says that. He says, you, meaning Porphyry, you, however, seem to think that knowledge of divinity, I like that really accusatory kind of bitchy tone too. You, however, seem to think that knowledge of divinity is of the same nature as a knowledge of anything else, and that is by the balancing of contrary propositions that a conclusion is reached. But the cases are in no way similar. The knowledge of the gods is of quite a different nature and is far removed from all antithetical procedure. It does not consist in the assent to some proposition, now, nor at the moment of one's birth, but from all eternity. It coexisted in the soul in complete uniformity. I think that's cool.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Now, and again, this might illustrate my lack of knowledge to like traditional Platonism, but from what I understand, it seems to me like this departure from pure reason as the framework for philosophical spiritual understanding is a fairly significant departure from traditional Platonic thought. Now, am I way out to lunch on that, or is that?
No, you're right. Well, remember, Neoplatonism is a kind of a combination of, and by the time, Iamblichus and Porphyry are around there, Platonism and Aristotelianism have kind of combined. So, it certainly is not a jump to say that to disparage in any way reason or rationality is definitely going against the grain of traditional Platonism.
Right. And I mean, that's why I keep coming back to this idea. And like, I feel like I'm kind of stuck on it, but like, was Iamblichus a reactionary or a progressive? Like, I think that is a relevant question, is all. In the context of the history of the time, at least.
Well, I think he's yeah. I mean, let me just say one thing about reason, though, because that's an important concept. Historically, in terms of history, what we think of reason, we think of as scientific knowledge, right? In the current day, it's closely allied with and attached to the scientific process, the scientific methodology. It has its roots in European Enlightenment, where reason itself becomes detached from emotions, it becomes detached from many other activities and become something alive and only unto itself. Platonism didn't really believe that a reasonable life or a rational life was detached from our emotions and from our bodies, et cetera, et cetera. They were combined. So it is important to make that distinction, because when we think of what Iamblichus is talking about, it is a type of holistic rationality that he's saying, okay, this is a reaction to a way of thinking which seems to think that you can just kind of talk your way through figuring out what life's problems are about, instead of this experiential aspect to them, which goes above and beyond words. I mean, it goes above beyond words. It goes above and beyond reason and any type of conceptual categories that we can formulate. And we can inculcate that within ourselves in some way or
Yeah,
other.
it's really important that you said that, actually, because that's why when I read a lot of the old books, it kind of isn't making much sense to me. But yeah, I think reason then is different to the reason that we use now, because now it's pretty much intellectualized, and I don't think they meant it in that way.
Yeah, I really like that term, experiential reasoning. I'm definitely going to steal that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think too. I mean, it might not have been the thing that people picked up on and carried and made part of like what we think of as Platonism, but this is embarrassing. I don't remember what it's called, and I don't really remember what it was about. But I'm pretty sure there is a Socratic dialogue where Socrates shows up and he says, hey, do you know where knowledge comes from? And everyone's kind of like, no, Socrates, where does knowledge come from? And Socrates is like, oh, well, I don't know. Let's go ask this illiterate peasant boy over here. And they go over and he like basically leads him through like a trigonometric proof. And he's like, see, no one ever taught you that, right? And the boy's like, no. And Socrates is like, see, so knowledge is really a property of your soul that you're innately able to know. And that if you just sort of go through the steps, you'll be able to uncover the knowledge that you didn't even know you had. And and nobody, I think, interpreted it in this way that Iamblichus is saying here, that like, oh, so therefore, when it comes to these principles, you just innately know them forever and ever. But I think that it's not a strain of thinking that's completely foreign to Plato, and that that we can find hints of it here and there, that you could conceivably construct that argument from and consider yourself a good Platonist.
Yeah, there's a lot. That's that dialogue is the Meno. It's called the Meno. Yep. And Plato definitely had these notions. When you read dialogue like the Phaedrus, for example, and Iamblichus and the other Neoplatonists, are really in many ways alluding to Plato's amazing dialogues about the soul flying off to different realms and having experiences in other realities. Those are things that certainly Iamblichus is playing off of, but he's still taking it a step farther in some way by saying that we can somehow inculcate these practices. I mean, I think, and it's not by purely contemplation, which would have been Porphyry's. I'm not Porphyry's, but Plotinus's approach. We don't need to have any rituals. We don't need to have anything. All we need to do is contemplate, to discuss, using our dialogue and using our reason. We can certainly discuss the pros and cons of issues, and then we can go into a contemplative, meditative state and rise higher to where we eventually realize our true self, which is above and beyond this world. So Iamblichus this is the milieu within which Iamblichus is bringing forth this notion of what he's calling theurgy. But what is unique about what he's saying is what we have to really explore and look at in further detail.
I think it's cool. I think it's the difference between pure and applied math, you might say. I think that like the difference is, it seems that in a lot of this sort of contemplation, or the idea that I actually think that a lot of these philosophers agree on a lot of the context or something, or like the foundations. Like they agree that we're all kind of in this situation, and a lot of the difference just comes to what do you do about it? What's the practice that you can undertake? And I guess I think that can actually explain a lot of the differences between their worldviews that they're presenting, or at least the implied differences between the worldviews that Iamblichus says, well, you said this, but I say this, even if we don't necessarily have the original list of questions. But at least according to Iamblichus, when he says that you asked me this, and so, but I say this, we have some idea of like the difference between their views. Yeah. But I think that a lot of those differences aren't necessarily because they're coming from different premises about what a human is and what a soul is and how these things work. But I think a lot of it is coming out of the practice that each of them is engaged in, that one of them is saying, well, what I'm going to do about this situation that we both agree we're in is I'm going to contemplate and come to some kind of absolute knowledge. And Iamblichus is saying, okay, man, I'm going to do all these rituals and I'm going to come to some sort of embodied experience. And we'll both compare notes.
Do you see it then as absolute knowledge? Because something, and this comes from like commentaries on Neoplatonism I've seen rather than the texts themselves. But from what I understand, it seems like the whole. I'm trying to think of who exactly I heard say this, but it doesn't matter. Like one of the key elements to Neoplatonism, to be a practicing Neoplatonist, is to utilize your own experiences and logic and reason to come to conclusions. Do you see that absolute knowledge then as being universal or as being individual? Is there a similar path, or do we all walk the same path up the chain, so to speak? Because oddly enough, I actually see Iamblichus as much more concrete in that. Whereas someone like Porphyry or Plotinus, it is based on like the individual's sense of these things. Whereas in Iamblichus, it is, we do these practices produce replicable experiences, you know? Yeah, I see maybe, oddly enough, that even though it might seem a little bit like counterintuitive, I guess, I do see Iamblichus as a lot more concrete in his knowledge framework.
That's interesting that you say that, because it comes across as at times abstract, right? But if it is concrete, it would come through and it's lived experience, right? With the Iamblichus.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's not something I know. I always ask these questions during these things, and I'm like, I don't necessarily like, I know that there isn't like an answer, you know. It's just, and I think that that's what's so beautiful about this philosophy, you know what I mean, is that we do have the chance to like delve a little bit deeper into its meanings, and, you know, in our own frameworks of knowledge. And that's what I really like about Neoplatonism, you know.
But you asked about whether it's a universal knowledge, right? Is this something like, but you see, to me, that might be misleading, because if I think of a universal knowledge, it's like I can take something and bring it back and do something else with it. And I've only had glimpses of this in some of the theurgic stuff that I've been doing. And some of the reading, if you look at some of the essays on the spiritual vehicle, it's a total shutting down of sensory experience, thinking experience, whatever, any kind of thing, and then it's an openness to another reality, and it tends to get really hard to talk about after that point.
I think that's what makes it universal. is because it's not that same kind of knowledge. Like that's exactly the thing in this end of chapter 3 here, when he keeps saying you can't treat this as though it's maybe he's actually probably saying I'm using the wrong word. He says you can't call it knowledge. You can't call it knowledge because it's not like you're over here and you're knowing a fact about a thing over there. It's something else that is, it's inseparable from you. It's just there, and you existing is the same as you knowing it in some way because it's just there, and we can't fall victim to the tendency to like split hairs about it in the same way that we can split hairs about something else because you can't, it's not subject to that kind of thinking. I guess maybe absolute or universal is the wrong way to phrase that, but that kind of undivided, I don't know, you can't even call it knowledge. What do you call it? we kind of reached the limits of words here.
Yeah, and I think that's where Iamblichus is. I mean, this is amazing that Iamblichus can still begin to, he kind of pieces it out, right? He's pulling the threads. He's saying, okay, well, this is a philosophical thread. This is a theological thread. This is a metaphysical thread. And then here's a theurgic thread. So I can talk about the philosophical, the theological, etc. But when I get to the theurgical, that's where I may be at a loss for words. But he's such a great thinker in that he can actually do that and bring Porphyry back to, well, he kind of puts him down all the time. But, some of the essays I've been reading about Porphyry, Porphyry's one of these guys, he just likes to ask questions that he doesn't even know the answers to, but he's honest enough to know that he has the question. So you kind of have to respect him for that fact, that he's going to ask questions that he doesn't know the answers to, but he will ask questions because it's important to ask those questions. But here you have Iamblichus, and he's saying, well, okay, so you're talking about it in this way, you're talking about this, and he provides the answers, and eventually gets down to the point where he's describing these experiences in such a way that you can begin to almost get a glimpse of the other side, if you will. You could say, well, wait a minute, that might actually exist. That might actually be real. Which I think is fascinating.
Also, what's kind of mind-blowing to me is that he sets this all out at the beginning and says, all right, well, that's basically kindergarten. Like, now that we've gotten that out of the way, now that we understand how to eliminate dualistic thinking and abide in the, like, universal knowledge beyond all distinctions, now we can really have a discussion. It's like, what?
Yeah, no, it almost rings of a lot of academic texts I've read in modern context, where it's like, yeah, okay, we understand all these theoretical frameworks, right? Okay, now let's get to the meat of it. Which is, yeah, I mean, I guess academics have been the same from time immemorial.
Yeah.
One thing that I kind of wanted to touch on before we go, and this comes from like lack of understanding on my part, is the sort of like levels of soul that are touched on within the third chapter. It talks of daemons, talks of heroes, talks of purified souls. Now, my big question that I'm coming to when I'm reading this is, are these beings emanated? Well, and I know that ultimately the answer to this is going to be both, but in a little bit more of a concrete sense. Like, are these beings emanated? Is their starting point, so to speak, the Aeneid, or are they coming from materiality up? I guess is it a down-up framework or is it an up-down framework?
It's a
I
down.
think it's up-down. Oh, is it?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Here we go.
It's down. It's down from creation down through the different realms, down to materiality, and ultimately down to pure matter, and which could be conceived of as evil in some way.
Oh, yeah, that's what I meant too. I meant it starts at the top and they go like
Yeah.
the pure souls come down from the one and they don't go any lower than that. It's not like they start as humans and then they stop halfway up along the way somewhere.
Well, now our souls are created, by the demiurge. So the human soul has an origin. It gets, well, depending. This is where it starts getting really fuzzy. But yeah, the soul does have its source in the one, but then it comes down through there's a spark, which is then created and put into another, combined with another soul. So the soul is combined of both an irrational and a rational soul. And it's where those are combined, and then it has a further journey into materiality, which is where it's created and put into this vehicle is attached to the soul, and then that vehicle is what travels through the other realms down to this material world. And it's that spiritual vehicle or that soul vehicle which we have to purify in order to begin to ascend again to back to the one.
So it's cyclical then. It's both, really.
There's definitely a cycle, yes, because they do believe in reincarnation, if that's what you mean.
Right.
But it's nice that you talk. Go ahead, Farzan.
No, I just wanted to ask. So, wouldn't it be both? Like from this perspective, we're ascending, but then from a heavenly perspective, it's descending, and then it becomes one. That's kind of how I thought of it, or
Yeah, yes,
like
it's descended here, and then now we can go through a process where we can ascend.
okay, yeah.
And he's going to teach us. Well, he's not. He's going to say that it's possible. He doesn't really give us any practices that we can actually follow to do that, except for telling us, hey, the possibility is there to do it.
Yeah. But I kind of think of it as like, does that happen as an end goal, or does that happen without our realizing it? Like, are we ascending when we're in deep, dreamless sleep? Like, how do we know? I mean, sometimes I feel like that it happens without our knowledge. But then within the level that we've reached, we seem like, it hasn't happened yet. But what if there are glimpses of it? What if it does happen all the time? Because there certainly has been times where I feel like my experience has been with the one, that there can be short-lived and glimpses and experiences and then back down again because it hasn't become developed enough. So when I've kind of gone through this idea of we've descended and now it's an ascension, I don't know if that's fully true.
Sure. Well, there are many.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there are many techniques, and certainly, the entire or one of the main techniques is to disengage the soul from the body.
Yeah.
And sleep is obviously one way to do that. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just going to say there's another Neoplatonist too, other than not Porphyry, but Plotinus, I think, who does believe that basically there's an aspect of our soul which is always identical to the one, and that all we have to do is basically stop getting distracted by everything else, and that part you don't need to go anywhere because that part's already there naturally.
Yeah, and it's kind of like there are all of these different schools of thought, but what is it that I know to be true? So it's well and good listening to somebody or reading somebody, but then what do I know to be true? I think there is a constant, and it's always there, and it's available all the time.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think that goes back to what we were discussing with the like innate knowledge of the divine, right? Like,
yeah, and it's almost as if sometimes the steps are not needed. The ascension is not necessary. I mean, I think as an overall, I think it is necessary. That's why we have the process of life. But I think that there are times and instances where you reach the end, even though you haven't got there yet. So there's like a paradox. Like it's all happening at the same time. And then if I can tap into that, then I'm there. And then I lose it again because I am so embedded in the world.
Right. Yeah, I think that entire process of losing yourself is the big part of both what Plotinus is saying and what Iamblichus is saying. However, Plotinus, as King was talking about, Plotinus believes that the soul is always with the one. It never falls. For Iamblichus, there is a falling. There's a falling into materiality, which occurs,
Right.
and the soul has to make its way back.
He might say that, but he also says, well, it's interesting. I think that we might be about to critique Iamblichus here. This is going to be my first anti-Iamblichus sentence I've said all this time. But I think he might say that, but at the same time, when he does talk about this innate knowledge and how this, like, it's innate knowledge of something that's outside of time, and so you can't use the way that you think about temporal things to think about this, and you can't use your temporal thinking to understand this. I mean, what does that mean? Like, how can that possibly be subject to a temporal process of falling and coming back? You have to, if it's beyond time, how does that progress? How does that become something that you can actually lose rather than just missing it, even though it's like there can't be a time when it's there and a time when it's not if it's outside of time. And he does say, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah. No, and I'm just going to say that the difficulty for me is the sustaining it, the sustainability of it. Like it's short and there's glimpses. So maybe it is both, and the more that we grow in our consciousness, the more that it's sustainable.
This is so funny because I'm very interested in Platonism and things because I'm coming from kind of Western esoteric traditions. But these days, my actual main sort of spiritual practice that I actually do most of the time is a form of Buddhism, a kind of esoteric form of Buddhism. And their idea of Buddha nature is almost, I'm realizing, comes up against almost these exactly identical questions. And their answer is almost exactly that, which is that, like, everybody has it, it's there all the time, but you have to discover it. And once you discover it, you have to sustain it. And that's actually the bulk of the practice, is learning how to sustain it, how to deepen it, and make it last longer and go deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately they all are saying that, because in a person's experience, it must be like that, because I can't understand how you can live life being on this path and not have glimpses of it, because that's how you're going to know. And then you're going to have to learn how to sustain it and inculcate it and accumulate it and strengthen it.
Let's all become theurgists.
Yeah, you learn and you teach me.
I agree.
I almost see, like, and King, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this coming from like the Western esoteric background. I almost see an analog to like the Gnostic Sophia or even like the Holy Spirit in Christian frameworks, which in my interpretation is kind of this like underlying knowledge that exists pre-materiality, right? It exists before descent into materiality that then guides us on our path back towards the one. Which, like, again, I guess maybe all of this is to say that, like, maybe there's something to the perennialist argument after all, right? Like, I don't know. I keep thinking of that as this conversation's going, and I'm, again, by no means like an expert on Gnosticism or Christian theology, but my understandings of those concepts also seem very similar, and I find it very interesting that that also exists in the Buddhist case, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. That's why I'm
go ahead.
interested in real life experiences. Like, what is it for you? Like, what has happened in your reality? What is it in your existence? You know, a book can say this, someone else can say that, someone else can say that. And yeah, I have great respect for them. But I'm far more interested in what's real for me and what's real for you and what's happened to you and what's your experience of it and what's your conclusion.
I think that can be an interesting way of reading too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like as an individual. Like,
Yeah.
I'm far more interested in who exists today. I mean, of course, I read all these books, but I'm far more interested in who exists today, because you exist today, I exist today, and there's a reason for that. And maybe times are different. And maybe old models don't work as well. I mean, a lot of them don't.
Speaking of which is why I don't know a lot about Gnosticism. It doesn't really match up with my experience. I don't necessarily, I mean, it does in some ways that I'm surprised by, but I don't generally want to live my life thinking that I'm living in a prison. But
Yeah.
kind of somewhat related stream is, since we've been talking about Hermeticism, for me, that idea of like, well, maybe you're drawn back to the source of it all because you came from there originally and you have a spark in you that wants to like return. Actually, that makes me think of a myth that I believe is from the Corpus Hermeticum. Actually, I think it might be even the very first one. I think it might be part of the Poimandres. I'm not sure. I don't remember, but it's basically the like less adversarial, less like the world is a prison telling of how a divine soul came to take on material existence as a human. One of the myths is basically that like there was this sort of divine human principle that was part of God, and or that's not quite true. One of the sort of earliest creations, I guess, of God was what was to become the human soul, sort of the primordial man. And the primordial man looked down from heaven and saw sort of the heavenly spheres, which all went down through space and ended with Earth in the center or the bottom, and saw that this was when he looked down, he saw like his reflection, basically, like Narcissus, and decided, wow, this is really beautiful. I want to go down there and see who that is. So he jumped down from heaven, fell through the spheres, all the planetary spheres from Saturn down to the moon, fell through the moon, landed on Earth. And as he kind of ping-ponged and pinballed his way down, took on the qualities of the planets, became subject to time and, astrology, the motions of the stars and all this stuff, and became an actual physical human being. But sort of like why did he do that? Why did he come here? It's because he saw his reflection. It's because he saw that this creation was a reflection of this same principle that he comes from, which is also the common origin of both of them, which is the divine, or the Godhead, however you want to say it, the one. And I think part of the reason probably that these Neoplatonists can mix in these Egyptian or Hermetic ways of thinking into their own philosophy, and it kind of goes together, is because they all have that kind of basis, common basis, where they can converse to the point that people think that even when Iamblichus is saying things that seemingly come from Hermetic texts and Hermetic doctrines, people think he's just fudging Platonism a little bit because of how similar they are. But I think that we can make the argument that they probably agreed before that.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting maybe place to take take a rest and then come back next time. What this led me to ask was, especially with the myth, is if we believe that there's a soul, if we were to buy into this whole mythology that Iamblichus and these other folks believed in, why would a soul ever want to choose to come to Earth? And are there reasons for not coming to Earth? What would those be? How is there a possibility of never coming back? What would that mean, not coming back, and that kind of thing? And he does provide some answers to those things. So maybe this is a good way where we can stop and look at those questions for the next time.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay. Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a good chat.
Okay, I'm gonna put this recording up.
Oh, is there a channel?
Yeah, I'll put the recording up on the general channel.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you everyone for talking about this. Even though I had, literally nothing to say here, since I'm completely new to this, it was quite interesting to hear what you all have to say. And I would just like to ask for the next meeting, next session, we will be doing chapter 4, right? Up to chapter 4. Yeah,
let's try chapter 4, 5. How's that?
All right, I'll read up what needs to be read up, and I probably have a lot of questions by then.
Excellent.
All right, see you next week or so.
Thank you for coming. Yep.
Don't worry about being a beginner either. I'm a beginner too, and I've been talking this whole time.
Oh my.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm definitely a beginner. I could tell by this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, you guys. You have a good week, everyone. See you around.
You too. All right. See you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.